Hello, everyone. We are happy to host you for the fifth webinar in our series. This one is titled Religion and the Coronavirus Pandemic, and we have with us Varuni Bhatia. Varuni has been teaching history at the School of Arts and Sciences, Azim Premji University. Her research interests include the Bhakti tradition, religion in contemporary India, modern Hinduism, and secularism. She has recently published a book on modern day memory and memorialization of the 15th century Krishna devotee from Bengal, Chaitanya, and she has many more publications. Welcome, Varuni.
Thank you, Nikhil. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, what I'm going to do in the next half an hour is to really give you a very, very broad overview of what I think as someone who is deeply interested in the question of religion in contemporary India. So I like to tell when I teach in my classes, I like to tell my students that religious stuff just catches my attention. It's just something that if there's a small piece of news on something that is religious, even if it seems completely inconsequential, I'll probably, click on it or turn the page to it and read it. So I am someone who is interested. I keep a track of what's going on in the realm of religion largely in the country, even though I may not always have the sophisticated analysis around it that can come from established political scientists or sociologists and so on and so forth. But as a student of religion and as a historian, I find myself constantly fascinated by religious transformations that take place in society. Now, when the pandemic broke, obviously people were focusing on many things that seemed so immediate to our lives, livelihoods being the most important one and the most immediate one that had to be paid attention to. The migrant worker crisis, the public health crisis that our country is currently undergoing. So all of these are, of course, the topics with regard to the present day pandemic that are extremely immediate for us. And of course, these are the ones that have captured much of our attention in the last few months. But being the kind of person that I am, I was also looking at the religious news. And more than anything else, I also found myself paying attention to these imperceptible but very real kind of things that take place on social media, on WhatsApp groups, on chats, YouTube videos, on websites, and so on and so forth. Thank you, Nikhil. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have been observing in the last few months and how I place it in a larger sort of understanding as a person who's interested in religion. Now, I should put it out here that this is going to be a bit of an overview. So if you're looking for detail or more analysis, I'm happy to talk to you more about it. I'm happy to discuss readings. We can do lots of things. We can start a study group. I'm happy to do all of those things. But right now, what you will hear is a bit of an overview. It may seem simplistic in places, but I'm hoping that what I'm presenting to you is the surface, and we can really scratch the surface to go deep on any of the issues that I will be talking about. So with that caveat, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharing the PowerPoint slide presentation that I have with you, because a lot of what I will say draws upon imagery. Imagery is very central. Okay. So give me a moment while I start sharing the slide. So now, when I will be talking to you about religion and the COVID-19 pandemic, I also want to clarify that the religion that you will see in these slides, at least, is going to be mostly, overwhelmingly Hindu religious traditions in contemporary India. The reason is twofold. One, I have most closely been following Hindu traditions and Hindu responses to the pandemic. And two, given that we are a Hindu majoritarian country, it seemed somewhat, natural to me to look more carefully at what is happening with Hinduism and then moving on from there. Some of the arguments that I'll make, or some of my observations, are going to be equally valid, if irrespective of which religious tradition you are looking at, and some of them will be very specific to Hinduism. Some of them will be very specific to Hinduism in India, in a Hindu majority country. Okay, so I just wanted to put that out there. So, to just start off the bat, really, this is what brought me to this question. And as I was thinking about how I would like to present this to you, I came up with this kind of a threefold schema that I found most compelling in this context. So when we try to study how religion and this particular pandemic have influenced each other, because right now I'm not saying that one has influenced the other only. I think that this is a two-way influence that I'm looking at. The first thing that comes to mind, of course, are religious responses to the pandemic. And when you think about religious responses to the pandemic, the most obvious one, and the one that got most pilloried, one could say, in the secular media, was the cow urine drinking party that was held very, very early on. This was in March, I believe. Now, one of the first things that come up to question is, what is the role of science over here? And the other points for me that are important in this context would be, what are the kind of myth making that is taking place? What are the new kinds of deities that are appearing, or how are older deities becoming reformulated, reframed in the current context? And are there any new demons, quote unquote? If there are deities, there are also demons. So what's happening over here? So I'm going to talk about religious responses to the pandemic in the context of the role of science and the role of myth making, new goddesses and new demons. The second thing that I want to talk a little bit about are practices of religion. And in the context of practices of religion, I think what has been really interesting for me to see personally is the increase in digital religiosity. By digital religiosity, as it will become clearer, what I mean is people participating online in religious activities. Now, this could be a congregational activity of coming together and praying, conducting kirtans or bhajans, or any kind of, listening to sermons, any kind of religious activity. It could also mean religious activity that has to do with offering prayer, conducting darshan in the very Hindu practices of religiosity that we can see around us. So that to me has been quite interesting to notice. The other thing is domestic religious practices. We are in a situation where we cannot go out. Religious sites are out of bounds at present, although I think the law is sort of moving in different directions at this point. And there has been increased religious practices that happen in the domestic realm. And in that context, the larger question for me that comes up as a scholar of religion, as someone who's interested in religion, is what are the ramifications of these changed practices on secularization? Can we then say that our society, that Indian society is, due to the pandemic, it's getting a fillip towards greater secularization? Because one of the things that we often hear is that Indian society is has such prominent presence of religion in the public sphere that we cannot simply think about religion being privatized in India in the way that we can typically see in the West. So is this the time then for us to think about secularization that is taking place almost organically as a result of this pandemic? The third aspect, which I'm actually not going to touch upon, but I do want to place over here, because I think if I did, I would never be able to finish this presentation in 35 minutes. So this third point is about the state and religion, particularly law. and the manner in which legal, the manner in which law is once again being called upon to adjudicate over religious matters. Now, this is not new. This has happened in India. Law has always adjudicated over legal matters. But in this context, it's public health that is the important conversation vis-a-vis law and the state. And I just want to flag that in particular, I'm talking about religious congregations and what kind of congregations the law has been okay with, and what kind of congregations the law has been extremely reticent to look upon favorably or to allow, and what that has meant. I'm particularly thinking about the Jagannath Puri Yatra, which while it is very clear that all kinds of precautions were taken, but the yatra itself was allowed to take place, while many other similar kinds of things are not necessarily non-Hindu. I mean, the Kavadiya pilgrimage, for instance, which is a very, very central North Indian pilgrimage that takes place in the month of Shravan, has not similarly been allowed, for instance, right? So the law has been has been making these responses as you go along, and this has been interesting to see for me in this context. Okay, so moving on. So when you think about religious responses to the pandemic, for me, what is specifically important is the religion versus science aspect of things, although the other three will also come up in a central fashion. And when I think about religion versus science, what it does, at least in the context of India particularly, and in the context of Hinduism very specifically, is that it brings forward the rationality versus superstition dichotomy once again into focus. So we hear a lot of people, and this came out in the questions as well. There were questions that talked about, but how do we do? There are all these faith healers who promise all kinds of healing, but of course they're going to fail in the face of this pandemic. Or isn't it irrational or superstitious to be worshipping deities, or to be thinking that something that is religious will cause this disease to go away? Now, per se, I think the rationality versus superstition debate is a specifically Indian, particularly Hindu reworking of the religion versus science debate that takes place in the context of Western Christianity. And in the context of Western Christianity, that debate is an extremely located, historically located debate in the 16th and 17th century with the scientific revolution. The reason why it's located over there is because the scientific revolution was supposed to have challenged religious ways of understanding the world, and provided the Catholic Church with some of its most strong challenges regarding the way in which the Catholic Church understood how the world worked. Now, in the context of coronavirus in India, it's not so much about religion, but it's always about superstition. It's a very, very specific understanding of religion that we have over here, that there are certain religious beliefs that are superstitious. And so it works under a certain evaluative criteria where certain kinds of practices are fine. So obviously you could be sitting at home and doing meditation, and that is not superstitious. But if somebody is worshipping Karuna Mata, then that becomes a superstitious act. Now, my understanding over here is that, is it possible then to think about these categories not as mutually exclusive ones? I'm trying to actually go encourage us to think in ways where the rational outlook and the religious outlook can in fact exist together or parallelly in the same context. And we see that the most when people, and this is not a great representative picture for that, but we see that the most when people will do everything that modern science asks them to do in order to keep themselves safe from the pandemic, and yet do something extra, something more than that, right? So you will have you will hear of a lot of these cases where people will wear the masks, or will follow social distancing, or will do everything that is being asked of them to do, but at the same time, as an addition, will also do the worshipping of the gods, or will do the mantras that they're supposed to do, and things like that. So there is a way in which the what I'm seeing at least take place in many contexts is that there is an understanding that you can do both, and that nothing is too much in the context of this pandemic. Of course, you should do what science is asking you to do, but it doesn't harm to actually worship a goddess as well, and ask her to, to keep you safe, right? Now, I won't go through what's everything on this slide because it'll take up too much time, but the point that I largely want to make in this context is that healing and religion has been very, very intertwined in the Indian context. In South Asia, and here I mean Indian as across religious boundaries, we know healing and religion has been central in Hindu, Christian, Islamic contexts in India. And we know that there are certain sites and certain deities particularly responsible for different kinds of healing, both in all the three religious traditions that are prominently present in India. Now, in the case of Hinduism, the goddess Shitala is probably the most famous one. In southern India, she's known as Mariamman or Yelama. And these goddesses have been known to be pox goddesses. Now, there is a very interesting way in which a person with a religious outlook would think about a pox disease that they or anybody in their family has. The pox disease is both seen to be a blessing by the goddess as well as a curse of the goddess. So the goddess herself lies on the cusp of somebody who is benevolent and malevolent. The presence of the goddess is in the form of a pox, whether earlier on it used to be smallpox. Of course, now that smallpox is gone, we are looking at chickenpox much more. But the whole idea is that if you have a pox disease, the goddess is visiting you. So there are 2 or 3 ways that you respond to it. One is, of course, that you could, be treated for it. But the other thing is that obviously, as you know, once you get a pox, there is no treatment. You basically have to go through it, suffer the symptoms and then come out on the other side. At least with chickenpox, smallpox was fatal much more than chickenpoxes, of course. But the idea would be that the kind of rituals and worship of these goddesses would invariably involve aspects that would be very religious. So it would be about, bringing in a priest, bringing in an intermediary, doing various kinds of worship. But it would also involve stuff that, for want of a better word, we can see in the context of modern science as being a kind of a vaccination, or using certain kind of ingredients that have antibiotic properties to them. Now, with the worship of Shitala, one thing that was ritually done, at least in Eastern India, was to inject the dried up pus of a person who had survived the pox into a healthy person's body. And this was a form of inoculation or variolation that was carried out traditionally in societies. Similarly, the use of neem leaves and turmeric was very much a part of the ritualistic understanding of what it meant if the Amma visited you, or if Shitala Mata visited you. In North India, as many of you know, I don't know how it is in the southern India, but in North India, when somebody gets chickenpox, it is called Mata Aayi Hai. So it's considered that the goddess has come to you, and that you just basically have to go through the symptoms of it. So what I wanted to do by talking about this is to say that there are already existing disease goddesses in the context of Hinduism. So I actually waited for Karuna Mata to show up. Honestly, since March, I was waiting for Karuna Mata to show up. Because I was like, if there are pox goddesses, how is it that Karuna Mata is not going to happen? This is an epidemic. Goddesses have come up in epidemics. There's a cholera goddess, there are pox goddesses. It took a while until I could find the first evidence of Karuna Mata. And surprisingly, prior to Karuna being deified as a goddess, Karuna had already been somewhat demonized. And that to me was a very interesting thing. That the process that happened in the context of Karuna was that images such as this one, where Karuna is shown, basically people would dress up as Yamraj, as the god of Hindu god of death, and go from place to place and enact how dangerous certain aspects of coronavirus were and why people should practice social distancing and so on. So this whole idea that corona was something to be feared got established much sooner than the Karuna Mata as a deity that needed to be propitiated got put in place. And that I thought was an interesting thing that happened in the context of Hindu responses to the virus. Similarly, the earliest Hindu response, as a matter of fact, and this is as early as March, this is the festival of Holi, where the day before Holi, Holika Dahan takes place. Corona had in fact been turned into Asura, into a demon. I mean, Yamaraj, as we know, is still on the godly side of things. Here is Karunasur, and this Karunasura was, the effigy was burnt on, prior to Holi in Mumbai. So we see that the demonization takes place before the deification takes place in the context of coronavirus and Hindu responses to coronavirus. I just wanted to point this out because this also then leads to the way in which the Indian response in general, and I think global response too, has largely been around notions of invasion, outsider invasion into the body. Now, this could be the body politic, this could be the social body, this could be the healthy body of an individual, but this idea of the virus as something that is attacking and invading has been the most prominent one that has circulated and recirculated in all kinds of imagery. And I will show you at the end where the most problematic circulation, of course, of this kind of a thing comes out. But I just wanted to flag that unlike the emergence of a mata or a goddess, where you are looking at ambivalence, in the case of corona, of this virus, the ambivalence was removed and the demonization took place very, very quickly, very, very early on vis-a-vis this particular virus. Now, as far as myths were concerned, there were some really funny things that were going on. This is during lockdown 1, where myths, existing myths were purposed in order to send a certain kind of message. Now, if you look at this one, this particular shared chat image says, of course, you should watch the Ramayana, but please remember, all you have to do is to behave like Kumbhakarna, which is that you sleep and you eat and you sleep and you eat. Please do not try to be Hanuman and go out to find a cure or go out to find herbs that will cure this virus. So I thought this was a very interesting way in which, in fact, the framing of the message is religious, but the actual message itself is, in fact, not a religious one, but very much one that talks about be safe, be inside, practice social distancing, don't try to go out unless absolutely necessary, and so on and so forth. So this, I thought, was an interesting meme that did that kind of a messaging very effectively. On the other hand, there were memes that were not so good or not so funny. And I think this is a very important one. This meme basically said, Well, do you recall the very first lockdown of the world, referring to the line drawn by Lakshmana, asking Sita to remain inside that line while he goes and helps his brother Rama with the golden deer, with hunting the golden deer. And the meme reads that if you know what happened when the first lockdown was disobeyed, referring to the fact that Sita was abducted by Ravana. Therefore, stay at home. So there's a very crude messaging going on over here. It is outright misogynistic messaging that takes place. But these kinds of messaging were, I would say, both the crude one and the more interesting, quirky, funny one were both very efficient and were doing the rounds quite rapidly on social media. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you got versions of these messages in the early days of the lockdown. This is from lockdown 1, so I'm talking about April, basically. This is the month of April that I'm talking about, right? Now, if I look at religious practices, moving on to my second point, if I think about religious practices and what is happening during COVID-19, the presence of online groups and activities that went up, this is something that I have on anecdotal evidence. So I don't really have images or quotes from somewhere to show you about it, but this is something that I have very strongly heard from anecdotal evidence. I was teaching a class on religion in India last semester, and the students in my class were asked to write about how things had changed around them when it comes to the practice of religion. So how things had changed in their own homes or in their neighborhoods, or what they could observe, and things like that. And based upon that evidence that I have, which since I don't have permission, I won't quote from it, but what it seemed to me that there was a lot of increased online religious activity that was taking place. And this meant that self-help groups were going up, which meant, if there were already existing groups who would occasionally meet and do something religious, they were also turning into different kinds of self-help groups, for instance, and they were, of course, continuing, but in an online forum, the kind of activities that they were doing earlier on. Now, when I say online forum, a lot of the stuff was happening on spaces like WhatsApp, which is something that is extremely accessible. So when I'm talking about increase in online religious activities, I'm also talking about these kinds of community formations that do not require an extreme degree of sophistication in using digital methods. This, the increase in looking for a community online was something that certainly happened in the has happened in the last few months. But I think what has also been very, very interesting is the response of religious institutions and organizations. And I'm over here focusing exclusively on Hindu religious institutions and organizations. But something that I noticed took place is that there was an increase in all kinds of online activity, which includes that would be able to replace the physical presence of a devotee at a temple. So the big temples or any kind of religious organization that was able to make this change did make this change. Now, the two temples that I will show you certain images from, one is the Kashi Vishwanath temple in Banaras, and the other is the ISKCON temple in Bangalore, both of which very sophisticatedly have continued to be present online on different kinds of online platforms, while telling the devotees, please do not come to the physical temple. So there has been that kind of a response that has been a very clear and interesting one. And in the process, they have also been responsible for raising certain kinds of social awareness around COVID, while obviously constantly saying that, God's blessings are very important and so on and so forth. So this is from the ISKCON temple, and I found this to be extremely interesting. In the wake of the present COVID pandemic, the temple is closed to public. I saw this about 2 months ago. I went today. It is still closed to public. So it's closed to public. Chant Hare Krishna for the welfare of the people. And then, of course, there was another one that said you can still be blessed by watching live darshan of the Lord. So the whole point of, let's say, channelizing the devotee towards a live darshan, rather than being like, okay, you can come to the temple, or maybe you don't have to, just stay at home, just worship the deity that is at your home, so on and so forth. Nothing like that. Specifically channelizing the online devotee towards a live darshan is really interesting. And here I have a screen grab of the online darshan from ISKCON temple, because I clicked on the live darshan tab to see what was going on. And this is kind of what you see is going on over there. So as you can see, a very limited number of people, only the ordained monks who live on temple premises is my understanding. I haven't spoken to anyone here, but perhaps only those monks who live on the temple premises conducting a puja that then is captured and telecast on their website to whoever is interested in the live darshan. Talking about live darshan, this is a screen grab once again of the Puri Rathyatra, which took place in right now is July, right? Yeah, early July. And this Rathyatra was controversial because it was a public festival that was allowed. It went through a lot of legal back and forth, and finally the permission was given for a public Rathyatra to be held in Puri. It came under some criticism, but it went ahead anyways. As you can see, nobody was allowed to come to Puri for the Rath Yatra. The railway station and the airport were closed down. However, people living in Puri, if they had tested negative for COVID-19, would be allowed to participate in pulling the Rath and in being a part of the Rath Yatra. So those were the rules that had been put in place for it, right? Similarly, this is a screen grab from Kashi Vishwanath temple website. And as you can see, there was a lot of social service, awareness generating messaging that was taking place from the temple website itself. Okay, so cleaning your hands, stay at home, we will defeat coronavirus. And this is from very early on. So these screen grabs, in fact, are from as early as April. So during lockdown 1, Kashi Vishwanath temple was very strongly giving out messages that nobody should step out. When I checked again more recently, the temple is open to devotees, but there is some kind of a token system, I believe, in place for going and visiting the temple. But these, what I'm showing over here, these these are still available even today at the temple website. You know, washing hands, so on and so forth. Now, and I don't think we can talk about religion and the coronavirus pandemic without really touching upon Islamophobia specifically. This is in the wake of the Tablighi Jamaat event that happened, incident in March, the echoes of which we heard for a very long time, and it's only more recently that these have died down. But the early months, the early weeks and months were marked by Islamophobia in the kind of at least Hindu response that we saw to the pandemic. And this is a screen grab again from Share Chat. These kinds of messages were not uncommon at all. And versions of these messages you would get at different times. I have a few more disturbing messages. I did not put them up online because I don't think these messages need to be disseminated in any way or in any forum, even if they are being critiqued. But it was important to note that the Hindu response to the pandemic, if not across the board, but a certain kind of popular Hindu response did um, indulge a lot in Islamophobia, but at the same time, it did what I think was a very unique aspect of the Hindu response to the coronavirus, which is demonizing the virus. Right? So if you think about that, and if you think about the way in which, if you can see the pattern over here, the Islamophobia came in the wake of the kind of very strong anti-CAA, anti-NRC protests that were taking place in the country right when the lockdown was first introduced. And then the Tablighi Jamaat incident that took place, and then something like this, a meme like this starts to do the rounds, where the idea of the invader, the outsider, gets solidified in imagination in a certain kind of a fashion. So I think this was a particularly disturbing aspect of the large Hindu response to the pandemic that I feel that has gone away from immediate attention. I think our immediate attention is on the public health system at this point, but it was very, very present in the month of March, April, even until May. Okay. So if I were to just make a few concluding remarks, oh yeah, I'm 5 minutes over time. Okay, so what my basic interest in presenting to you the material that I presented was to think about how does COVID-19 relate to secularization in India, and what is digital religion going to do to abet or not to abet secularization. So will the pandemic lead to privatization of religion and secularization, or will things return to normal as the pandemic recedes? And I think as a person who observes religion, I would say yes and no, because things will not return to normal, but new normal is being created very, very rapidly, not just in terms of religion, but with everything else, particularly how we socialize. I think we should not undermine the new normal of socialization that is taking place. And if, like me, I'm a huge follower of Durkheim and his understanding of religion, that religion is eminently a social thing. If socialization itself is undergoing fundamental change right now, then it is obvious that religion will undergo that change as well. And I would basically argue that digital religiosity will increase in India. I don't think there is anything going back to it once those groups have been created, once the online pujas and the online kirtans and the online prayer meetings and the online sermons have all started, the online weddings have all started. I don't think there is a going back, because there is something to say about the incredible, participation that we all do in the digital world, that's likely that's not going to decrease. But at the same time, I don't think the significance of religious spaces, whether it's temples or any other kind of religious space, is going to proportionately reduce. There are two reasons why I say this. I think people will do the digital stuff and the physical stuff the moment that they can. But also, I think the digital presence of these physical spaces has increasingly gone up, has increasingly become more and more sophisticated, and so on and so forth. And that means that the sacred spaces will only find greater presence in the virtual world. This may or may not be true, but I think the state is going to continue to hold ambivalent positions vis-a-vis religion and public health, in the sense that I think that the state is probably going to open up certain events more often and close certain events more often. I don't see the state or the law necessarily taking one position and then continuing to do that in, for the foreseeable future till a vaccine is out and so on and so forth. Most obvious in the fact that while the Kavadiya pilgrimage is not taking place, the Puri Rathyatra did take place, for that matter. We are likely to see more examples of religion and science coexisting with each other. We are likely to see more and more examples of religion playing a secular role as well, because it is not the dichotomy is going to continue to break down in certain context in that regard. And I don't think the externalizing of the disease and the demonizing of the disease is going to continue in troubling ways, and probably be personalized in troubling ways too in the foreseeable future, which I don't think is necessarily the best thing for a pluralistic society to develop. So basically, this is something that I think is the way in which things are going to go in the future. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, or I can keep this up here, and if there are any questions, I can take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Varuni. That was enlightening. Quick note for all the participants: if you have any questions, please put them in the chat window. I am taking keeping a tab of them. We already have around 6 questions, but if you have any more, please add them in the chat window. Also, a quick note that once you are done with the webinar, the discussion can continue in the special interest group, which is on the alumni portal. I am quickly sharing the link to it so you can all access it. This is the link to the portal. It's accessible only for those who are on the portal. But if you're not on the portal, you can always write into this email ID. Like existing students might not be able to access it, but you can always write into the alumni office, and we'll make sure that the questions go to Varuni. So we have a few questions. PG asks, I don't know who, it says PG, but the question is that when we draw interlinkages between religious healing and rationality, do you think we distort the societal structure, especially in rural India? For example, traffic victims in West Bengal are purified through religious leaders to erase committed sins. So that questions the practice will relegate one to being an outlier and characterized by constant stigma. The question is how and where does any intervention need to be hinted at in such situations?
Okay, so I guess what you're asking is that I'm not trying to interlinkages. I'm not making interlinkages between religious healing and rational healing. What I'm trying to say is that these are two different frameworks of even understanding what is disease. And in those two different frameworks, the logic of the religious framework of understanding what is disease is not the same, cannot be the same as the science, as a framework offered by science to understand disease, which is the framework of germs, right? And we know that that this whole idea that germs cause disease is something that was invented only in the 19th century. Prior to that, even in the Western world, how did contagious diseases happen? They happened out of miasma. There was this whole miasma theory of disease, that basically it was bad air that came up from the swamps and caused cholera to happen, and so on and so forth. So in many ways, because I was going through it very fast, maybe you thought I was drawing interlinkages. What I was trying to say is that there are different frameworks of understanding what causes the body to be diseased. And if you think about a non-Western medicine way of understanding what causes disease, then there are these other understandings of the body and understanding of a disease, which allow for alternative practices to emerge as healing practices. Now, the efficacy of those practices is constantly up for question. Obviously, I understand that, but if somebody understands disease to be in a certain way. Now, what I'm saying happens in the case of Corona Mata is that the understanding of disease has actually not gone in the religious dimension fully. It has remained perfectly, even to the most a person who's not familiar with scientific understanding of disease, even for them, it is clear that this is a disease, this needs a vaccination is going to be the cure, so on and so forth. I don't think that there is this idea that something else can cure it, because I don't think a fully religious understanding or this, a non-Western scientific understanding of the disease has taken place. But what has happened is that the symbols of of the religious understanding of disease, that there are demons that cause it, or that's caused by affliction, that it's a possession of a certain kind, those have been used in strange ways then to in fact extend things like Islamophobia, other kinds of things in our country. That's kind of what I was trying to say. So I hope that that answers some of what you were asking.
Yeah, I think so. So the next question is by John Kurian. It says every illness brings with it an element of unknown risk, which cannot be managed by medicine. So in case of COVID, where there's no medicine as of now, the unknown risk perception is very high, and perhaps that accounts for greater trust in religious practices. Some of these religious practices, like use of neem, turmeric, staying indoors, perhaps have a medical basis in their use and practice, which in turn makes the religious element attached to such practices to strengthen. So there can be some overlap between medical science and religious practices, some good, some not so good.
Yep, I agree with that, absolutely. I don't think that our yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. On a related note, so a question by Riddhi Pandey. I wonder how we can make sense of the Ayurvedic response, which was also heavily popularized by the Indian state to coronavirus and its Hindu religious roots. Here I'm referring to the Ministry of Health advisories, but also the large amount of content circulated by individuals prescribing Ayurvedic and yoga practices as preventive, if not a cure. Is it fair to consider that these responses are in some way religious as well?
So, first of all, I don't think Ayurveda is the same as religious. I think that Ayurveda is a particular system of medical knowledge that understands the human body in a certain fashion that is deeply rooted in Sanskrit texts. So I would hesitate to simply call Ayurveda a religious response. See, Ayurveda doesn't say go worship Karuna Mata, right? And so there is something that's happening over there. Ayurveda has its own understanding of the body. Now that is not the anatomical understanding of the body that Western medicine has, but it still has it's a different understanding of the body, and how body responds to diseases is dependent upon that understanding of the body. So to answer your question, what do I think of the state? Now, in many ways, I am less worried that the state said you should also do Ayurvedic practices like gargle or consume milk with turmeric in it and things like that. Some people were extremely disturbed by it. I was not. But I also think that we are in a situation where we don't know, right? I don't think anybody, not even an Ayurveda practitioner, is going to come up and say that we know for sure. So in that sense, so that would be my particular response to the question. But per se, I think there was always the idea. So the Indian state's response, now particularly Ayush Ministry response and those kind of guidelines, which were doing the round in a big way, I think in April and May. I think right now the numbers look so frightening that for most part, we are thinking of it simply through the lens of public health, and correctly so, no doubt about it. But at one point, those forwards were extremely prominent, extremely common, and they would come in all kinds of ways. And they didn't simply come from the Ayush Ministry or something like that. oftentimes they would be like, my close friend who is a good doctor in X, Y, and Z hospital in your city has said you should do these things. And they were all about some or the other kind of either home remedies or something based in an alternative medicinal system, but something overall not harmful, so that sort of a thing. So I hope that kind of addresses the question.
The next question is by Parandama. He asked if some of the temples in our country are currently warning devotees that they should not use alcohol-based sanitizers. Specifically referring to the priest of Bhopal Mao Vaishnava Dham Navdurga temple. So what is your take on this?
There is a Vaishnava Dham Navdurga temple, and that's very interesting temple if I can get to visit it. But I don't have a take on it because I am not I'm not qualified to have a take on it, apart from saying that even according to doctors, what you should be doing is washing your hands with soap and water, and that the efficiency of soap and water cannot be matched by alcohol-based sanitizers. I'm not sure whether the people in this particular temple are using this as a way to promote hygiene, through soap and water. That would be a good idea. Otherwise, yeah, I don't necessarily have a take on it, except that this is seems to be a way of saying that, oh, you should have nothing to do with alcohol. Do not even put it on your hands. So.
Makes sense. So there is a question. I think two people asking the same related question, Nandita and Sher Dagar. Online will be the new normal, but how accessible will that be for all? Who are the people who will be left out in this realm of online worship?
Who will be the people left out? That, yeah. I think that remains a very central question, who will be left out. But I don't think online worship is ever going to have the same kind of debates that online education has had. Now, online education is very much about who is being left out and is very much about the digital divide. And those are extremely important questions to consider, especially in the context of India, but everywhere in the world. So I feel that, the left out question in terms of worship is also kind of influenced by the digital divide idea, and the idea that how that debate is unfolding currently in the realm of education. In my understanding, the practice of religion online is a phenomenon that is happening. But that doesn't mean people who don't have access to digital devices are not religious or are not doing religious practices. So that is something that will always stay there. Unlike formal education, and if formal education turns fully digital, then you in fact are left with a large number of children in our country who will not have access to it. That's not the argument that can be made for religion. Secondly, if the dissemination of the smartphone technology is seen in India, I don't have numbers on my hand, but I can assure you that the dissemination of the smartphone technology and cheap data plans are high enough that they may not be able to support online education, which of course they can't, but they are quite capable of supporting all kinds of WhatsApp forwards regarding all kinds of religious content, including content that simply has to do with, some kind of worship, some kind of deity, some kind of, and I'm talking very, very local. I'm not talking about the examples that I gave that were large temples all over, in Banaras and Bangalore. So I think digital religion is definitely here to stay.
Thank you for that. I think we are almost at the end. Thank you, Varuni, for everything. Thank you for taking the questions. As I mentioned to the participants in the middle, you can keep your questions coming. I've shared the link. It's also put up on the same alumni portal page. So if you need it, you can always go back there. You'll get the link for it, and you can add in any more questions, comments that you have about the webinar. Thank you, Varuni. Any last words from you before we
Uh,
close?
no, I mean, I think thanks a lot. It's been quite interesting to speak to this audience and to really force myself to organize my very confused thoughts on what I had been seeing around me, particularly in the Hindu religious practices in the world around Hindu religious practices during the pandemic. So thank you very much for allowing me to do that.
Thank you.
Okay.